Today's real horror of AI. I love this. It's because people don't understand the landscape, because they don't understand how evolved components are. There's almost this fairy tale belief in the powers of AI. I listen to various executives say they're not going to worry about their legacy environments because in a couple of years they're going to be able to go to ChatGPT and say, transform my legacy environment into something new, and it's magically going to do it for them. In most organizations, we are led by stories. And the problem with stories is that when you challenge somebody else's story, well, you're actually challenging the person. Because we tell everybody great leaders are great storytellers. So when I challenge your story, I'm saying, I don't think you're a great leader. And so people get very defensive. If you get the story down on a map, I can say, I think the map is wrong without challenging the person. So what happens is these maps become a way of multiple groups of people communicating, creating consensus and challenging each other over a space because it's an imperfect representation. My name is Simon Wardley. I build businesses. I'm a terrible engineer. And by a bunch of accidents, I created a mechanism of mapping competitive landscapes, both, including economic and technological, political and social. And so I'm sort of known for mapping, and which I find fascinating anyway, as in the subject. So that's me. Oh, awesome. I also live in a swamp as well. Well, we call it a marsh, but I like to think of it as a swamp. So, it's raining heavily at the moment in the UK, so hopefully it doesn't fill up too much.
For people who don't know yet, well, in a brief way, what are Wardley Maps? Why is it called Wardley Maps?
Oh, blimey. Why is it called Wardley Maps? What are Wardley Maps? Okay. So many, many years ago, I was running a company. I realized that I didn't know what I was doing. I mean, I was making things up. We were very successful. But in a pursuit of trying to understand what it was I was doing, I read every book I could find on strategy, was getting nowhere. Ended up in a bookshop. A bookseller said, had I ever read Sun Tzu's The Art of War? I hadn't. She persuaded me to buy several copies, because they're all different translations. I don't speak the original Chinese, or I certainly don't read it. And it was in reading these translations I noticed a pattern. So Sun Tzu talked about 5 factors that mattered in competition. 1, have a purpose, a moral imperative. 2, understand your landscape. 3, understand the climatic patterns, the heavens, the weather, how the landscape is changing. 4, understand principles of organization, how you organize, structure yourself. And 5, you're into gameplay. So purpose, landscape, climatic patterns, doctrine, principles of organization, and gameplay. And I was fascinated by this, and it got me into understanding landscape. And I realized in military history, we'd use maps to understand and organize movement of resources, understand how things were changing. And I thought, well, this is probably why I'm, I don't really understand what's going on with my business, because I don't have a map of the landscape. So I went back to my organization, asked everybody to send me loads of maps, and they did. Mind maps, customer journey maps, systems maps, loads of them. But one thing I noticed is every single one of these maps, if I moved a component on it, kept the lines the same, but moved the component, it didn't change the meaning of the map. Now, if I take a geographical map and I move a country, it does change the meaning of the map. So it turns out that every map I had, all the things we had in business called maps weren't maps. They were graphs. And so this then sent me on a journey, which ended up with a whole bunch of accidents to creating a map. And the map is very simple. You think about the users, you think about the user needs, you understand the chain of components needed to meet those needs, and then you simply ask how evolved those components are. And that's basically how you create a map. Now, why did it end up being called a Wardley map? Because I'm lousy at naming things. So the first thing I did was I said, well, it's got a value stream in here, or a value chain. We'll call it a value chain map. And somebody said, no, there's things called value stream maps. And, okay, fine. And then I came up with a number. No, I said, well, we'll call it a strategy map. And somebody said, no, there's something called strategy. Oh, gosh. So I just said, oh, right. Well, there isn't anything called a Wardley map. Because my name's not common, so we'll just call it a Wardley map and be done with. And that was it.
I love that.
And so I found it very useful. So I made it all Creative Commons, thinking that, maybe a few other people would find it useful. Back in when I started this in 2005, I sort of assumed that people learned how to map when they did MBAs. And mine was this cheap and cheerful way of mapping, because I had never done an MBA. And then I subsequently discovered about 6 years later that you don't learn how to map at MBAs. I'm not quite sure what you do learn. I actually teach on a number. They actually invite me to teach a whole bunch of MBA students actually now how to map, which is quite hilarious because I still haven't done an MBA. But it turns out that looking at your landscape before you make a decision is useful for a number of people.
What I love about Wardley Maps is from my own research is that you always start with the customer need, whether you're looking at the map from multiple perspectives, whether it's internally from your company's point of view or from a customer's perspective. It always starts with the user. My actual question is, where do you think most beginner mappers get stuck? And how do you help them focus?
Okay. Think of Paris. Okay. If you want to create a perfect map of Paris, it would have to be 1-to-1 scale, which means it would be the size of Paris. And as a map, that's completely useless. All right. So first thing to remember is all maps are imperfect representations of a space, and they have to be imperfect in order to be useful. So the first thing that people fall down on is they try and create perfect maps. Don't. All maps are imperfect. Your maps will be imperfect. That's fine. Okay. So what we're actually pursuing are better maps. So we start off with our first map is a blank piece of paper. And so what we want to do is create a better map than a blank piece of paper. Which is why we start by thinking about who are the users, what are their needs, what are the components involved, how evolved those components are. Now, what I'm also doing is I'm exposing my assumptions about how to build something onto a map. Now, why is that good? Well, in most organizations, we are led by stories. And the problem with stories is that when you challenge somebody else's story, well, you're actually challenging the person, because we tell everybody great leaders are great storytellers. So when I challenge your story, I'm saying I don't think you're a great leader. And so people get very defensive. If you get the story down on a map, I can say I think the map is wrong without challenging the person. So what happens is these maps become a way of multiple groups of people communicating, creating consensus and challenging each other over a space, because it's an imperfect representation. Key things to do when you start mapping is remember your first map is a blank piece of paper. So just put a line for evolution at the bottom, which is like things evolve from Genesis, custom, product, commodities. You put that at the bottom, do a dotted line for value chain, and you just immediately go, right, who are the core users? We'll put those on the map, and then we'll say, what are their needs? Okay, we'll put those on the map, and then we'll go, what components do we need to meet those needs, and maybe go a few more layers down. And then we have a very imperfect map, and we hand it to somebody else and say, I think this is how the system works. What do you think? And so you invite them to come and challenge, and it's through that action, because how things operate, how things run, how we build and create things is usually in the minds of multiple people. It's not normally in the minds of a single person. So by enabling them to communicate, to challenge, to share information in a fairly safe environment where we're not attacking each other, that's fundamentally what maps do. So to not get stuck, just realize, one, all maps are imperfect representations. Two, you're just trying to create a better map than the blank piece of paper you had before. Three, share it with others and ask them to challenge the map you've created.
One thing that makes me think about, perfect representations is people might map out the entire business, but I'm not sure if this is the way it should go, right? Should people narrow down their scope, focus on the immediate business strategy first, or that concerned division, whatever product they're building?
So I map industries, I map nations, I map individual projects, individual businesses. I know people who map themselves. So the important thing is to start somewhere. Remember, maps are, you might have an atlas, you might have a country map, so a world map, a country map, an individual town map. You can get multiple layers to a map. And when you map, any single component can in turn out to be an entire map itself. Okay, so what you tend to do is you think, all right, if I want to map a space, what is the space I'm going to map? So just put the title down. Put the date, because there's no time on a map, but maps will change over time. Same as geographical maps. 300 million years ago, the world did not look like it does today. So, the continents, the tectonic plates had shifted. So you put a date down, and you simply start with users, and you add components, and every now and then it gets really, really messy. And so what you do is you might take a bunch of components and just have a common word for all of those, and we'll remove them. And then maybe later on somebody says, oh no, we really need that component back in. So it is that process of working with others, just to add in components and to have that discussion about what there really is. And you can start at any layer. The critical thing is to start. So how long does it take to learn to map? It normally takes 9 years. Okay? It takes 9 years to learn to map. The first 8 years and 11 months is going, I really need to learn how to map. It's a bit like my guitar back there. You spend 8 years, 11 months looking at the guitar thinking, I really need to start to play it. And eventually you spend the final month where you actually pick it up and you learn to play. So it normally takes a long, long time for people to get going. Not because it's difficult, but just simply because they get distracted. And it's like the tennis racket in the cupboard, telling you to go and play tennis, but you keep on forgetting.
Oh, we should play when I go to London. What's interesting about Wardley Maps is it just gives you situational awareness, right? Primarily for the landscape. I think you said something around, without the awareness, you're like playing chess blindfolded. I just love that quote.
It's more importantly, you're playing chess without any awareness that there is a board at all.
You don't even know if it's chess.
It's like what you see is a computer screen with a couple of, with a pawn, a queen, a king, etc. And you're playing game by just pressing. You go, press the pawn. You don't know there's a board. You don't know there are multiple pawns. You don't know that when you press a pawn, one of them will randomly move. But you'll play the game with these sequences. So, and the problem is what will happen is people will put all these sequences into their big data systems and come up with magic sequences of success. So the sequence might be pawn, 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 queen, or something along those lines. And people will just come up with, you should press the pawn button until you can press the queen button, and then press the queen button as much as possible. I mean, it'd be ridiculous things like this. And then you will play a game of chess against somebody who can actually see the board. And you will lose so quickly. You have all your big data systems, all your secrets of success, all of it, but you'll just get wiped out. And you'll be writing down the sequence. Oh, I pressed pawn, they pressed pawn, I pressed pawn, they pressed queen, I lost. That's fool's mate. And you'll be like, right, pawn, 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 queen, trying to use that sequence against others. Of course, it won't work. Because when you press a pawn, it's not one pawn, there's many pawns tiles that could move. You can't see the board. By the time you get to the queen, you're a 1 in 15,000 combination that it's going to work. And this is all from the fact that you cannot see the environment. So you start thinking everything's unpredictable. You coming up with random words like it's a complex adaptive system. It might well be, but it might also be a system that isn't, that you can make lots of predictions over if you can see the environment. But purely because you're blind to this environment, you were completely unaware it even exists. Everything seems random. So it's that sort of difference. It's terrifying.
I think a lot of, mature veteran business leaders know this kind of is instinctively, like in their heads, right? But then putting it on paper as an artifact, as a platform to communicate these out, and uh, get the other people to collaborate with you on that map. I think that's the greatest value it provides, and just makes the entire organization more efficient that way.
So I love that because a lot of people that I meet do have a mental model equivalent to the mapping. So they think about the users. They think about their user needs. They think about the components, the supply chain of components needed to meet those needs. They also think about how evolved those components are. So there's a world of difference between the genesis, the first time something's created, the first ever computer, and then custom built examples and products, and then basically commodities. The way you treat things will vary depending upon how evolved those components are. And so, yes, completely agree. A lot of people have an equivalent mental model to this. One of the things about explicitly writing it down is what I tend to do is what I call premortem, postmortem. So before we do something, we create the map and we use the map to challenge what we're going to do. And so we'll think about, have we thought about all the users, all the components? So an example of this would be Her Majesty's Court and Tribunal Services, UK government. When we started mapping out, they'd had things like the judiciary, government itself, the public, as the main users. And of course, when we're looking at it, we thought, we're missing a user. Prisoners, they have needs, and that has a profound impact on the system itself. So, just a lot of people have the mental models, but by explicitly putting it down, and you can do this pre-mortem, and then we go and do the thing, and we do post-mortem, where we challenge the map after the event. So we go and build it, we look at what's actually happened, and we look at what the map said. And the reason why you do that is you learn patterns. And so I'm aware of 30 climactic patterns. So these are environmental rules, economic rules of the game is the way to think of them. Things will evolve. We have inertia. As things evolve, they will enable the appearance of higher order systems. So there's about 30 of those which are useful for anticipation. Turns out there's about 40 doctrine, universally useful principles. Things like focus on user needs, understand the components involved, the basics of mapping, all the way through managing inertia to designing for constant change. And then there's about 150 odd different forms of context-specific gameplay, which you can use to manipulate a space. So I used to run strategy for a company called Canonical. They provide something called Ubuntu. It's an operating system. So in 2008, we were 3% of the operating system market. We're against Microsoft and Red Hat. We mapped out the environment and used the maps to attack the space. It cost us $500,000. It took us 18 months. We took 70% of all cloud computing. So we went from 3% to 70% of all cloud in 18 months for $500,000.
Wow.
Because we could see where to attack. Okay, and we're up against people who have all the money, all the resources, and all the rest of it. So it's a bit like that playing chess. They've got all the big data systems feeding the sequencing. They're going pawn, pawn, pawn. We're looking at the board. I mean, it's not a contest.
That's incredible. Yeah.
So that's the difference.
The intelligence, just from the simple act of mapping and how it, informs you with the context to act properly, with the doctrine and different ways of attack. I love that about Wardley mapping. AI is, getting into the picture these days. It's
Sure.
almost on everyone's, like
You
phones
can't
or
escape it at
devices.
the
You
moment.
can't
Yes.
escape it. What's your opinion on that? Just
First of all, AI is a field, and within that field, there are many, many subtopics, including things like large language models, large multimodal models, all the rest of it. Back in about 2016, actually, no, I'm going to go back to 2008, and the early days of Ubuntu. One of the patterns you learn with mapping is that everything evolves if there's supply and demand competition. And as we shift from, say, product to commodity, we often have huge inertia to the change because of pre-existing practices. So people with large data centers had huge resistance to compute as a utility. But as things evolve, you also get a change of practice. We call that co-evolution of practice. And so we knew that we didn't know what the practice was going to be called, but we knew a new practice would appear. And that practice eventually got a name. Andy and Patrick called it DevOps. And we know it also creates higher order systems. So we got things like Netflix, etc., which create new sources of value and worth. So there's this basic idea that things will evolve. We have inertia to change. It'll create a new set of practices. New things will appear. Same was happening with serverless, just not at the infrastructure, but at the runtime level. So the runtimes become a utility with serverless, like AWS Lambda. You're getting a change in new practice, which eventually got a name. We called it FinOps. You get higher order systems appear, etc. And so back in 2016, we knew that, for want of a better word, a machine cognition was going to become more of a utility. I mean, AI is so many different things, but we'll broadly package it in, say, machine cognition. Certainly my thoughts mapping it back then was, well, why do we care? Well, what we cared was the combination. So when you took this and combined it with things like serverless, what we realized is we were going to get what we call conversational programming environments. And a friend of mine actually went and built this and presented this at AWS reInvent in 2018. So this was an AI system that you talk to, and it would build a system in the conversation with you. And it was based upon the ideas of Jonna Freeman and Nicholas Negroponte back in the 1970s, where the act of design is a conversation between the minds of multiple designers, and all that's happening is one of the designers is now a machine. So Simovic went and built this and demonstrated this at AWS reInvent 2018. And of course, by 2023, we've got industrialization of components like large language models, a new change of practice, prompt engineering, for example, and we've got examples of conversational programming. We just simply call them copilots. Very cool. All right. So it's all about the evolution of the underlying components, the change of practices, new things we can build, and it's unavoidable. The thing about evolution, you can't resist it, but you can try. But the benefits
which
of
is why
efficiency.
it's exciting, actually.
Well, yeah, it's
At least for
exciting,
me.
but it's also dangerous as well. So I'm very positive about use of various components like large language models and more particularly large multimodal models for various activities. I've been doing aspects of this for quite some time, but there are things you have to be careful of. One, you've got to change in terms of the language. We're going from declarative type languages to more contextual to conversational languages, I should say. So if you think about prompts are a Turing complete language if they've got memory. So we think about things like coding in C and coding in prompts, it's the same difference. Okay, it's just a different type of language, more conversational. So you've got a change of language. You've got a change of medium. So we think about coding systems with symbolic instructions as text. But with large multimodal models, the symbolic instructions include images as well. So you've got a change of medium as well. And you've got a change of tools. So rather than having a sort of very static constrained tool that you're interacting with, you've got a more conversational environment like ChatGPT or whatever it happens to be, or Copilots, I should say. So you've got a change of tools, you've got a change of language, you've got a change of medium. Sounds exciting, and it is. I mean, this is the sort of stuff that created the Renaissance and everything else. But here's the danger. Tools, language, and medium are how we reason about the world around us. So if you think about a tool like the printing press, language, the written word, medium like paper, if that is controlled by a small number of individuals, they literally control how you reason about the world around you. So it's a bit like if you're Charles Darwin and you're coming up and saying, I've got this idea of an adaptation of species. I think we'll call it evolution. If I control language, medium, and tools like the printing press, paper, and written word, I might just go to you, no, you can't have that word. And I say, well, I'll publish a paper. Not with my printers, you're not. Well, I'll write it down. No, not using paper, you won't. So literally, I control everything about how you reason about the world, which is why it's so critically important that all of this stuff is open sourced. And I don't just mean the code alone, as in what we traditionally think of code. I mean all the symbolic instructions. And symbolic instructions includes all the training data as well. So all of that stuff has to be open sourced. Of course, the lobbyists are out there telling you that'll create Skynet and isn't it dangerous? No, they're doing it out of self-interest. Okay, there's an outside possibility, I suppose, but otherwise we create a new theocracy. So it's unavoidable. It's inevitable in terms of we're getting industrialization of components and new practices, but there are dangers. Certainly from a sovereign point of view, if I'm a nation state, I would be very concerned about all the control of how my population reasons about the world around them. I'm just handing that over to a small group of people, which is why, nation states should be pushing heavily open source AI, not open AI, as in that company, which is anything but open source, but open source AI, as in all the way down to the symbolic instructions. So now how you play the game and how you think about the game depends. If you're a nation or if you're a company or whatever, if you're a company, you're just like getting on board, don't want to have inertia, etc. But just realize that these transitions, normally the winners and losers shake out in the first 5 to 8 years. And it's not clear who's going to win that battle at the moment. So just be prepared to swap. Don't put all your eggs into one basket and hope they're going to win, they're going to the moon, because that may not happen. All right? Was that helpful?
And, that's very helpful. Yeah.
Pleasure.
Like, the mind of a genius.
No.
High contextual information about what's happening. No, I like the views on, governance, safety, ethics, and just the philosophy of reasoning and using the technology. My question is, what kinds of doctrines would be helpful in this case? Like, is it still focused on the user? Like prevent the inertia?
Of course. Yeah. I mean, the doctrine are universally useful patterns, and it doesn't matter how the technology changes. I mean, they're still universally useful patterns as far as I can tell. So always focus on the user, focus on the user needs, understand the components. Yes, there's an awful lot of AI systems, AI quotation marks, being built purely because people want to put it on their CVs rather than actually meeting any user needs or anything else. Yeah, I mean, I totally a lot of people think, we should do some AI because others are. Try and focus on the users, the user needs, think about the components involved. Yes, there's a lot of different components within the AI field, whether it's large language models or whatever, which are useful in different places. So perfectly valid. I mean, this stuff is evolving. It's going to create new practices. It's going to change the way we do things in terms of machine cognition is now part of that landscape. So when we talk about cognitive capabilities, there's going to be elements of both human and machine. But it still doesn't change. Just because you use those components still doesn't change the fact that you should focus on the user and the user needs. So the doctrine's still the same.
Considering how, the field of AI can be your landscape, it's rapidly evolving. I
Yeah.
would assume someone has to update their map like every 30 minutes.
Well, okay, so
Yeah.
so that's there's a chap called Mark Craddock who creates some lovely Wardley maps of the AI landscape. He's actually built an AI system and trained it on Wardley Maps, and so he's using it to write blog posts on the subject and all the rest of it. There's about 13 different trained AI systems out there on Wardley Maps, and of course, people sometimes just use things like Claude or whatever it happens to be. Have a conversation with it and tell it to create a map for you. I mean, I use a tool called Glamorous Toolkit, which is an environment. You can think of it like it's a note-taking code environment. It's all about building tool sets. And tools, sorry, not tools, about building tools. And I'll explain that in a minute. And within that, there's embedded Wardley Maps and AI systems. And so I use that to help me quickly create maps. So yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things you have to be careful of, though. So I run research groups where I take 100 people and we'll map out something like healthcare. And we'll map out healthcare from multiple different perspectives. The reason for doing that is that if you asked a group of people to map Paris, suppose no one had ever mapped Paris, you send a group to map Paris, they come back with a map and you ask them what's important. They might say Pierre's Pizza Parlor, because they've mapped Paris from nice places to eat pizza perspective. All right. So what you need to do is, if you want to understand a landscape, you send multiple groups out to map from different perspectives. So healthcare, you would do the healthcare supply chain. You may be doing something, the role of AI in healthcare. You
Regulatory
might medical pathways, etc. So multiple. And then what you do is you can bring the maps back together. You ask all the groups what's important. You aggregate from that to identify patterns that really matter. And so I've done this across about 17 different industries, healthcare one, education, agriculture, and all the rest of it. And when you aggregate, you have to ask yourself a question: am I investing to improve the system from a social basis, societal basis, or am I investing to make money? So if you look at healthcare, if you want to improve healthcare within a system, your focus should be on health outcome based upon patient-reported outcome measures and sharing of medical data. If you want to make money, your focus should be on preventive healthcare and well-being. So those are very different things. And it turns out that almost all AI systems have a massive bias towards the market over society. Every single example of industry I've looked when comparing against multiple AIs, they always prioritize the market over society. So that's, along with removing your ability to reason about the space around you. One of the other dangers you've got to think about with AIs is biases. And for example, in policy, those AI systems have a huge bias towards market, because they're trained on market data. That's where the responses come from. There's less understanding of societal needs, so they're not focused on those aspects as well. So I would say, my general viewpoint is I like using various things like large language models, or even better, large multimodal models. I think there's all sorts of interesting potential. Focus on your users and your user needs. Think about AI as a component. It's a field, or within that field, there's various components that you can use. Do be careful about the tendency to rely on them. They strip away your ability, or they control your ability to reason about a space. and do be careful of the biases within them, particularly at a policy level. They're quite dangerous. Ideally, you want to be in a society where your government is pushing not only open source AI, as in the AI that all the code, all the symbolic instructions, including the training data, is open. You want it to be pushing on that basis. You want it to be you certainly want a government focused on society more than market needs as well. So it realizes that biases within this system as well. You do those sorts of things, it's manageable. Don't do these sorts of things. I think problems lie ahead.
I see. I think this is such a monolith, complex problem to tackle. We need a Wardley map on this. Exposing training data, how the model reasons. Actually, I don't think people know how the output is generated anymore.
There's been some fantastic. There's a paper published recently, which was basically been looking at the impact of certain documents on the training, and whether it was just retrieval strategy was being used by a particular training system, or whether there was some element of procedural. Because the problem with procedure is where we follow a process, like mathematical process, to get to an answer, and retrieval is we just go and look at it. And a retrieval is where we go down the path of stochastic parity, is probability-based, etc. The problem that we have is that most procedural examples of procedural knowledge can actually be, you can be hoodwinked by a rather smart retrieval system with access to other systems. So, and there was this particular paper, I can't remember it off the name at the top of my head, it was actually only recently, which demonstrated that there seem to be inherently different strategies. It's the first time I've seen that. Really, really quite encouraging. So yes, wonderful space, wonderful field, lots of interesting stuff. I'm all in favour, and just be mindful. And
in the AI field in particular, right? Like, what practice do you have affinity for? At least the emerging practices that foresee.
Well, beyond prompt engineering and my enjoyment of prompt insertion and creating various attacks and other bits and pieces, which I love doing in my in my spare time.
Like penetration testing on AI systems.
No. It's prompt insertion is just great fun. I mean, the one practice, the most important practice for me, it's the difference between, do we want a new theocracy where we hand control, or do we want a renaissance? And of course, I want the renaissance. And the only way I can see that actually happening is through government requiring open source AIs, and I mean genuinely open source AIs. All symbolic instructions being open. the Open Standards Initiative, recently came out with a new open source AI definition, which is, at least they made a nod to the fact that symbolic instructions includes more than just code, because they identified that data was important. But they put so many sort of caveats and other bits and pieces. It's actually more, I consider it more harmful than good. I mean, there was nothing wrong with the original open source definition. We just had to recognize that the code is more than just what we traditionally think of code. It's also it's all the symbolic instructions, which includes training data. So that's my big practice. That's my big space. In terms of should you be adopting large language models? Yes, of course you should. Particularly,
Why?
Why should you? There's certain activities which large language models, particularly those which aren't provable, which they are very good at. So, for example, writing content. General marketing content. I mean, or having that sort of, when I say not provable, I mean, if you've got something which has a definitive answer, because these are basically probabilistic, stochastic parrots, they will often give you, or they can give you a wrong answer. So what you don't want to be doing is being a lawyer asking a large language model to create a brief for a particular case, because it will give you the best brief it can, but it mostly may be fictional. But if you are something which can't actually check, so you're writing content for a website or whatever, I think these are great tools to help. And I think they're great in terms of assistance. So if you take the viewpoint, if I'm going to use it as an assistant creating something else, these can be helpful. So they're not so good for answering questions. They're very fast at answering questions, but you still have to go and validate the answer to the question. I mean, so they're not so good for answers, but they are good for helping you formulate questions. That's what I particularly like them for. So if I'm thinking about content, I'll get it to write me some content. I'll look at it. I'll modify, change it. I'll throw it back. I'll ask it to give me some ideas. It will give me some ideas, different ways of looking at it. So I'll work in concert with it. I don't trust the answers to it, though. Does that answer your question?
Of course. Like, I have this question from one of my teammates, right? And they love your work, so
Thank you.
I'm just gonna ask it outright. So, in your book, you talk about how higher order systems create new worth, right?
Yes.
Like electricity being a commodity that
Enabling higher
enables new
order
components, to serve new needs. So if we take AI as the new electricity, just for example, isn't it somewhat unique in that it's not going to generate any new needs because AI will solve them higher up the value chain?
It's going to create new needs, new practices. I mean, I'm sort of counting on it. I mean, my future dream job is to be a machine psychologist. So I spend my time working with these large neural networks, helping them come over some of their own neuroses, which they've developed over time. So the point about this is, as machine cognition industrializes more, yes, it's going to enable new components, often jointly in action with human cognition. So you think of it, things like centaur chess, apply different areas. But the thing is, those new activities are in this sort of uncharted, the genesis phase. So we don't really know what they're going to be. We know they're going to appear. No one knew that Amazon turning compute to a utility was going to enable Netflix to become a massive streaming company. We knew that things would appear. It's the same here. It's also interestingly part of the issue that. So in 1896, I think it was, New Catechisms of Electricity. I think that was Nehemiah Hawkins. Basically said all people would be unemployed because electricity would get rid of all jobs. And then we had Cybernation, the Silent Conquest by Donald Michaels back in the 1960s, which basically said computers would make everybody unemployed. Because it's easy to see the things which may be impacted, but it's very difficult to see the things that are going to be created. So, if you said to Nehemiah Hawkins, don't worry, people could be a radio operator, he would go, what's a radio? Or if you said to, what was it, Cybernation, Michaels. If you said to Michaels, don't worry, people could be social media consultants, you would go, what's social media? So the point about this is it's very, very, and that's why I make the joke about I'm going to be a machine psychologist, because there's going to be new activities created as a result of industrialization of machine cognition. We don't know what they are. We can see the jobs that may go away. So like marketing might increasingly be industrialized itself in terms of marketing content by large language models. Maybe aspects of filmmaking and story may change. It's going to impact on different industries, but it's also going to create new opportunities as well. We just can't see what those are.
And in terms of the new generation of entrepreneurs that are in this space who have the opportunity to choose the board they want to play at and make the moves they need to make, what's one thing you would say to them?
Sell out quickly. So obviously there's a lot of excitement and focus on AI at the moment, and particularly about large language models. And there's this sort of idea that it's going to head towards AGI and all the rest of it as well. That is not necessarily the path we get to AGI. We don't know who the winners and losers are going to be at this moment. It's not clear. There's obviously a lot of excitement. It may turn out that Amazon's approach in the AI space is a better play. It may turn out, maybe OpenAI will dominate. It may turn out the government will actually react. And so there's a lot. So we know it's going to grow. We know it's going to be used. We know it's going to create new practices, but we can't say who the winners or losers are at the moment. So there's often a little bit, you often get recorrections within the space as well. That's not abnormal. Once we get about 5 to 8 years, and we're only a couple of years in, it's much easier then to identify who the winners will be. So my advice is, if you're starting a new company in the AI space, expect a bit of turbulence in it. Don't put all your eggs into one basket, because that's not clear at the moment. Do focus on the new practices that are developing around prompt engineering, etc. And then do all the usual stuff. Think about your users, think about the user needs, think about the chain of components.
Do you feel like it's hard for people to just actually do that? Like focusing on the user? Like, because I'm a designer by practice, right? I'm a product designer. I've been trained this way, and it just for my mental models, like, oh yeah, you should start.
When I started mapping 19 years ago, these sort of principles of focus on the user needs, think about the supply chain, think about how evolved the components, and there's 40 of them, fell out of mapping. And I used to go to events 19 years ago and say to people, it'd be a really good idea if, when you're building software systems or building anything, that you focus on identifying who the users are and what their needs are. And people would look at me like, what's the point in doing that? We know what we're building. We've written a specification. And you just go, oh, God, this is just terrible. I mean, even today, I go into organizations who still don't know who their users or their user needs are. And when I say I would say it's still the majority. It's terrifying, 19 years later. Then you get into the supply chain, the components needed to meet those needs. I think you're probably down at, certainly there's really interesting things like SPOM, Software Bill of Materials, which was being pushed by the US government, which is great because it's forcing people to think about the components involved. But even the physical world, our understanding of supply chains is incredibly poor in most organizations. At best, they know one up, one down, i.e. who they sell to and who they buy from. I mean, they're all running off trying to do environmental, sustainability, social responsibility, whatever reports, trying to give carbon figures. For supply chains, they don't understand. So invariably, what it involves is a bunch of consultants sitting around a table making up figures. They pay them money to get that figure, and then they pretend that's their carbon. I mean, it's garbage. I mean, huge amounts of this industry is garbage. And so that's a big problem, massive problem. And then it gets worse, because if you do understand your users, the needs, and the components involved, how evolved those components are changes how you treat them. So if you think like making a cup of tea, you need a cup, you need tea, you need hot water, you need cold water, and a kettle, you need power. Well, your kettle, there's a world of difference between a commodity kettle I buy from a supermarket and a custom-built kettle I make myself. I mean, the practices and how we treat things change as things evolve as well. And so you get these wonderful people going, like, we should use extreme programming or agile everywhere or Scrum everywhere. And others go, we use Six Sigma everywhere. The answer is you should be using both, depending upon how evolved the components are. And it's the same with purchasing, finance, the whole lot. There's loads of these one-size-fits-all safe scaled agile framework. I hate this sort of stuff. I mean, you need to use multiple methods in different places. All of these lessons are still true when we think about the space of AI. And most organizations are really poor at this stuff. And so this then leads to the horror. The horror, today's real horror of AI. I love this. It's because people don't understand the landscape, because they don't understand how evolved components are. There's almost this fairy tale belief in the powers of AI. I listen to various executives say they're not going to worry about their legacy environments because in a couple of years they're going to be able to go to ChatGPT and say, transform my legacy environment into something new, and it's magically going to do it for them. It's almost a delusional belief in the power. It's called wishful thinking because it's a hard problem trying to deal with legacy environments. I mean, there is some. I mentioned Glamorous toolkit earlier on. There's a company called Think who specializes in this sort of stuff, and part of the problem is that when we deal with a legacy environment, how well do we understand that environment? Well, typically, if it's 10 million lines of code, what we'll do is we'll try and read the problem. We'll try and read 10 million, which is like madness. And reading and we spend usually about 50% of our development time reading. And it's the one activity we never look to optimize or question why we do. And part of the problem comes from the tools that we use. We use highly constrained tools, which are built with symbolic instructions, to look at a highly contextual problem, the system, which is built with symbolic instructions. So why are we using highly constrained tools? Why aren't we building tools to solve the problem? And mostly this is to do with tool vendors and profit in the industry, etc. Our belief that it's difficult to build tools. It turns out it's not. It's really easy. And the ideal way of working is usually you ask a question about a system, you build a tool, small tool to answer that question. As a result, it creates other questions for you to ask. So you build other tools to answer those questions. As a result of building tools, if it's in a common toolkit, you build up a model of understanding for the entire system itself. And the performance improvement of this is, I've seen year-long migration efforts fail time and time again, be solved in about 10 weeks by simply people taking a different approach to how they solve the problem. But it requires thinking. And rather than doing that, there's a lot of people think, well, hopefully magically we'll have this ChatGPT or whatever system. We could just go, take care of my legacy, press the button, and it will do it all for you. And I think, that's going to cause a lot of pain for a lot of people.
Just thinking about ChatGPT,
yeah,
it's just one thing, right? Like, it's just the LLM. But what about the other components? What about the other practices? What about the other activities? What about the other fields that comprise, where you're playing
AI itself, the whole field.
Yeah.
Well, it's a massive field, and I'm not an expert in this field at all. I mean, there are people who are much better trained and experienced than I am. So there's a chap called Mark Craddock who produces some wonderful maps of the AI landscape. I mean, he's been building and training AI systems for quite some time. So I'm always going to defer.
What's his name?
Mark Craddock. Mark Craddock.
How do we spell that?
Craddock, Craddock. And he's a lovely chap. You should get him on here. I mean,
Oh
and then
yeah,
he
like
can,
Mark, that's your sign.
yeah, yeah, and then
Let's call out.
and then he can tell you how I just talk nonsense, and he'll just but
Let's talk about that toolkit though, because it's a system of tools designed to understand context.
okay,
Like
so
what's a demo of that, or like what's a scenario of the usage of those
okay,
small
so
tools?
right, so Glamorous toolkit. Glamorous toolkit. Think of like Jupyter notebooks with live coding, AI integration, a whole bunch of other things as well. So like on steroids, etc. It's an environment for building basically tools, and because part of the problem that we have, we have an application, we don't understand the application, we have very constrained tools. We often try and use those constrained tools to try and understand the problem or build the problem. It's a bit like, I don't know, I build a house with a saw and a hammer and maybe a screwdriver. So I should therefore build a skyscraper with a saw and a screw. No, I mean, we'll use much more contextually specific tools for solving that problem, but we don't seem to do that in software systems. And part of the reason is that in software systems is we think tools, it's hard to build tools. Well, it turns out it's not. I mean, I'm sure tool vendors would like to tell you it's hard to build tools, but it turns out you actually, in the right sort of environment, you can actually very quickly build tools. And so this is what Glamorous Toolkit is about. It's an environment where you start off with a problem space, and you think about what's the question I want to ask, and then you normally build a tool to answer that specific question. So you import data. You might go and import some data into the system. You find it's JSON data. Someone's already solved the problem of parsing that, so you use that component within it, and then you will. And what it happens in the environment is you can create multiple different views or perspectives of what you're looking at. So every view or perspective is a different tool. And so you use that to try to understand what's going on with the system, which then leads to other questions. So you build other tools. And as a result, you end up very, very quickly building a model of understanding of the actual system itself. So it's a different way of solving problems. The best person in the world to talk to about that is Tudor Gerber. Tudor Gerber is at a company called Fenk. I'm sure if you ask Tudor to come and talk to you all about moldable development, he will come along and give you examples of how they use it as well. It is quite remarkable.
Oh yeah, well, we love more guests who are, who actually.
So it's Mark Craddock and Tudor Gerber.
How do we spell that name?
Tudor, Tudor, Gerber, Girba.
Okay.
Ask Tudor to come and talk to you about moldable development. Ask Mark Craddock to come and talk to you about mapping and AI.
I will. I will haunt their DMs.
Haunt them. Just tell them I sent you.
Wardley. This person named Simon Wardley sent me. Do you know him?
Blame him.
Well, let's end on a fun little question.
Yeah.
So, you spent years, teaching a lot of people, consulting, mapping for sovereign reasons. What's one lesson you've learned, from your own journey that still surprises you?
Oh, gosh, that's a good question. What lesson that I learned? That still surprises me. I'd like to say things like, don't be afraid to share. But I knew this before I started mapping, sharing, because I was fairly involved in the open source movement. Sharing is good. It's positive, encouraging. People are really kind. People are inquisitive. Okay, here's the one lesson I've learned. It's not a good lesson. Oh dear. The lesson I've learned is, and that still surprises me, is so much of business is based on gut feel rather than any understanding of the environment. We mostly use data not as a way of understanding the environment, but as a way of justifying gut feels that we've already taken. And I am still surprised 19 years later that so much of business is random gut feel. I shouldn't be. There was a wonderful paper by Marcus Fitzer which did decomposition of CEO impact, and it looked at the impact of about 4,000 CEOs on their companies and determined it was indistinguishable from random chance. So you could literally replace them with anybody off the street and it wouldn't make much difference. I was surprised back 19 years ago when I started to discover this problem. I'm still surprised by that today. That's not a very positive one, so I want to leave on a positive one. The thing that I am surprised, which I discovered and I'm so grateful for, is the kindness of people, though. People respond so well if you share. If you are willing to accept challenge, people can be really kind. They will give you prompts and push you and ask you questions, but they do so out of kindness. And despite the horrors I see in the world today, I still have utmost hope for future generations, because people can be very kind as long as we don't create systems which encourage people not to be.
To all the people creating those systems,
I wish they would go and live on another planet, preferably Mars.
Yeah,
that's not very
kind. Elon Musk.
I wish they would be kinder, but there we are.
Yeah. Like the first thing you mentioned, like confirmation bias at its finest, right? Like, go with the gut feel. But it's not surprising. But it is surprising. Well, with that, thank you so much, Simon.
It's been a pleasure, delight. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me along.